Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're journeying to Egypt, a land so steeped in history that most other countries look like they're still in diapers by comparison. This is where the Nile River has been playing the world's longest game of the floor is lava with the Sahara Desert, creating a green ribbon of life that supported civilization for over 5 millennia. From pharaohs who treated pyramid construction like an extreme home makeover show, to a modern nation that somehow manages to balance ancient wonders with contemporary challenges, Egypt's story is one of endurance that would make a camel jealous. Tonight, we'll trace this remarkable journey from the first pharaohs who thought, why not build something that'll confuse people for thousands of years, all the way to today's Egypt, where you can grab coffee in sight of monuments that were already tourist attractions when Julius Caesar was taking selfies with Cleopatra. So settle into your coziest spot, let your mind drift like a felucca on the Nile, and join us as we explore the timeless wonders of Egypt. Chapter 1: Ancient Foundations and the Gift of the Nile. Our story begins not with pharaohs or pyramids, but with geography, because as any real estate agent will tell you, location is everything, and Egypt hit the ancient world equivalent of the lottery. Picture, if you will, the longest river on earth, stretching over 4,000 miles from the highlands of Rwanda and Burundi all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile flows northward, which might seem backwards to those of us used to rivers that know their proper cardinal directions, but the ancient Egyptians weren't particularly concerned with our modern sense of geographical propriety. The river system itself is actually two rivers playing an elaborate game of merge and conquer. The White Nile provides steady, reliable flow year-round, like that friend who always shows up to help you move dependable, if not particularly exciting. The Blue Nile, on the other hand, brings the drama, carrying seasonal floods and nutrient-rich silt from the Ethiopian highlands. When these two converge in modern Sudan, they create the legendary Nile that would shape human civilization for thousands of years. It's rather like an ancient geological marriage. One partner provides stability, the other brings excitement and valuable gifts, and together they create something extraordinary. The Egyptians divided their world into two distinct regions, and with typical ancient pragmatism, they named them exactly what they were. Upper Egypt stretched from Aswan in the south to Memphis, characterized by narrow valleys carved between desert cliffs. Despite its name, it's actually the southern part of Egypt. The ancient Egyptians named it Upper because it's upstream, where the Nile flows from. Lower Egypt encompassed the triangular delta region, where the river fans out into the Mediterranean, creating a landscape so fertile it practically begged humans to settle down and start farming. The confusing nomenclature has been puzzling students for millennia, though ancient Egyptians probably found our directional confusion quite amusing. But the real magic happened every year between June and September, when the Nile performed its greatest trick, the annual flood, or as the Egyptians called it, Akhet. This wasn't the destructive, unpredictable flooding we might imagine today, but a gentle, life-giving inundation that arrived with clockwork precision. The flood deposited a layer of rich black silt across the riverbanks, creating what the Egyptians poetically termed Kemet, the Black Land, in stark contrast to Deshret, the red land of the surrounding desert. It was nature's own agricultural calendar, so reliable that the Egyptians built their entire yearly cycle around it: flooding season, growing season, and harvest season. Modern farmers could only dream of such predictability, though they'd probably still complain about the weather. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus famously declared Egypt the gift of the river, and he wasn't just being poetic, though he was being rather obvious. The Nile provided everything a civilization could want: fresh water in a desert, fertile soil for agriculture, fish and waterfowl for protein, papyrus reeds for paper and boats, and mud for building materials. It was essentially nature's version of a one-stop shopping centre. If shopping centres came with annual sales that lasted 3 months and actually improved your property value. The geographic setting also provided Egypt with natural security that ancient leaders could only dream of. To the west and east lay vast deserts that served as formidable barriers against invasion, though they did make for rather dull vacation destinations. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea provided both protection and trade opportunities, while to the south, the granite outcroppings of the first cataract at Aswan created natural rapids that marked Egypt's traditional boundary. It was like living in a fortress designed by nature itself, complete with a built-in irrigation system and room service provided by annual fish migrations. Into this geographical paradise came humanity, and they came early. Archaeological evidence suggests that people have been hanging around the Nile Valley for at least 700,000 years, which means humans were appreciating Egyptian real estate long before they invented the concept of mortgage payments. The earliest tools found near Abu Simbel, yes, the same area where Ramses II would later build his famous temples, date back roughly 700,000 years, proving that humans have always had excellent taste in location, even if their construction skills needed some work. Around 6000 BCE, as the Sahara began its transformation from a relatively green savanna into the desert we know today, people migrated toward the life-giving Nile in increasing numbers. This wasn't a sudden mass exodus, but a gradual process, like a very slow-motion version of urban migration, except instead of seeking job opportunities, these ancient peoples were seeking basic survival. The drying of the Sahara was probably the world's first climate refugee crisis, though these migrants had the distinct advantage of moving toward one of the most favourable environments on Earth. By around 5000 BCE, settled agricultural communities began appearing along the Nile, and these weren't just simple farming villages but increasingly sophisticated societies. The Badarian culture, named after the site where archaeologists first discovered their remains, emerged as one of the earliest and most remarkable of these pre-dynastic civilizations. The Badarians were skilled craftspeople who created exceptionally thin-walled pottery that would make modern ceramicists weep with envy. They also developed sophisticated techniques for working copper, demonstrating that ancient peoples understood the value of both beauty and functionality, a lesson that some modern designers might benefit from remembering. The Badarian settlements were relatively small and often seasonal, as people moved between farming, fishing, and herding livestock. Life was probably quite pleasant by ancient standards, with enough variety to keep things interesting but sufficient stability to develop genuine expertise in crafts and agriculture. They buried their dead with grave goods that included ivory combs, beaded jewellery, and the distinctive black-topped pottery that became their signature, proving that humans have always cared about looking good, even in the afterlife. Following the Badarians came the Nakada cultures, named after another archaeological site and divided into 3 phases that archaeologists creatively labelled Nakada 1, 2, and 3. These cultures marked increasingly sophisticated developments in technology, social organisation, and artistic achievement. The Nakada 1 period, also called Amritian, saw larger settlements and more prosperous communities developing along the Kina bend of the Nile, where the river takes a dramatic eastward curve through Upper Egypt. By Nakada 2, also known as the Gurzian period, we see the emergence of what can only be called proto-cities. Hierakonpolis, Nakada, and Abydos began developing into major centres of population, religion, and political power. These weren't just large villages, but genuine urban centres with specialised craftspeople, monumental architecture, and increasingly complex social hierarchies. Archaeological evidence suggests these communities were engaging in long-distance trade, importing goods from as far away as Afghanistan and Palestine, proving that globalization is nothing new, even if the shipping times were considerably longer. The town of Nakada itself became particularly prosperous, possibly due to its strategic location near the mouth of the Wadi Hammamat, which provided access to gold mines in the eastern desert. The ancient name means Gold City, which suggests either impressive marketing skills or remarkably straightforward naming conventions. Either way, the wealth flowing from these gold mines helped fund the increasingly elaborate culture that was developing in Upper Egypt. Hierakonpolis emerged as perhaps the most significant of these early centers. Archaeological excavations have revealed a complex of industrial, ritual, and residential areas that suggest this was not just a large town, but a genuine power center. The site included limestone temples dedicated to the falcon god Horus, who would later become central to Egyptian concepts of kingship. There's something poetic about the fact that the god associated with divine rulership was first worshipped at what may have been Egypt's first true city, though Horus probably didn't have to deal with ancient traffic, congestion. The material culture of these Nakada periods shows increasingly sophisticated craftsmanship and growing social complexity. Artisans created beautiful stone vessels from materials like basalt and granite, using techniques that required considerable skill and specialized tools. They developed faience, a ceramic glaze that would remain popular throughout Egyptian history and into the Roman period. Most significantly, they began experimenting with written symbols that would eventually evolve into the hieroglyphic system, humanity's most beautiful and enduring form of writing, even if it did make elementary education considerably more challenging. During this period, we also see the emergence of what archaeologists politely call social stratification, which is academic speak for some people started living much better than others. Elite burials from this period contain impressive collections of grave goods, including gold jewelry, ivory objects, and imported materials, while common graves remained relatively modest. This isn't necessarily evidence of exploitation. Many societies develop natural hierarchies based on skill, leadership, or simple luck, but it does show that Egyptian society was becoming more complex and specialized. The religious life of these pre-dynastic communities was already remarkably sophisticated. Evidence from burial practices suggests well-developed beliefs about the afterlife, with the dead provided with food, tools, and personal items for their journey beyond. The dry climate of the desert preserved many of these burials naturally, leading to accidental mummification that may have inspired later artificial preservation techniques. It's rather ironic that Egypt's greatest contribution to preservation technology began as a happy accident of geography and climate. Trade networks during this period extended far beyond the Nile Valley. Archaeological evidence shows connections with Nubia to the south, Palestine and Syria to the northeast, and various Mediterranean cultures. Egyptian-style pottery has been found throughout the southern Levant, while foreign goods appear regularly in Egyptian sites. This wasn't just occasional contact, but sustained economic relationships that brought new ideas, technologies, and materials into the developing Egyptian cultural sphere. The relationship with Nubia was particularly important, as Lower Nubia developed its own complex society, known to archaeologists as the A-group culture. The rulers of Nubia controlled trade routes that brought gold, ivory, incense, and other African goods northward, while Egyptian products flowed south. This relationship was sometimes competitive evidence, suggests periodic conflicts, but it was also mutually beneficial and helped drive the development of complexity in both regions. As we move toward the end of the pre-dynastic period, around 3200 BCE, we begin to see evidence of political consolidation. The various towns and regions of Upper Egypt started coming under the control of larger political entities, possibly through conquest, alliance, or simply the natural expansion of successful communities. This process appears to have centered on the three major urban centers of Hierakonpolis, Nakada, and Abydos, each associated with particular religious traditions and political ambitions. The archaeological record from this period includes increasingly militaristic imagery. Decorated pottery shows warriors, prisoners, and battle scenes that suggest warfare was becoming more common and more organized. The famous painted tomb at Hierakonpolis depicts what appears to be a ruler defeating his enemies, an image that would become one of the most enduring themes in Egyptian art for the next 3,000 years. Ancient Egyptian artists apparently understood that some themes never go out of style. This political consolidation process culminated in what Egyptologists call the Nakada III period, or alternatively, Dynasty 0, the final phase of pre-dynastic development when Upper Egypt was unified under a single ruler or series of rulers before the famous unification with Lower Egypt. This represents a crucial transitional period when many of the fundamental features of Egyptian civilization crystallized: centralized kingship, monumental architecture, sophisticated art styles, and administrative systems capable of organizing large-scale projects. The most famous figure associated with the final unification of Egypt is King Narmer, though he's also known by the name Menes in later Egyptian records, a situation that has provided Egyptologists with endless opportunities for scholarly disagreement. Whether these represent the same person using different names, or different people who played similar roles, remains debated. What's clear is that around 3100 BCE, someone managed to bring both Upper and Lower Egypt under unified control, creating the world's first large-scale centralized state. The famous Narmer palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis, provides our most dramatic evidence for this unification. This ceremonial object shows the king wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, demonstrating his authority over both regions. The palette's imagery depicts the defeat of Lower Egyptian enemies, though whether this represents actual military conquest or symbolic artistic convention remains a matter of scholarly debate, though the ancient Egyptians probably weren't overly concerned with modern academic distinctions between symbolism and reality. This unification wasn't just a political achievement, but a cultural revolution that brought together the different traditions of Upper and Lower Egypt into a new synthesis. The combined crown, called the pshent, became the symbol of unified Egyptian kingship for over 3,000 years. Religious traditions merged, with the falcon god Horus of Upper Egypt incorporating aspects of Lower Egyptian deities. Administrative systems developed to manage a territory extending from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean, a distance of over 600 miles, which represented the largest unified state the world had yet seen. The establishment of Memphis as the new capital symbolized this unification perfectly. Located at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, near modern Cairo, Memphis represented a conscious decision to create a new center of power that belonged neither to the old northern nor southern traditions, but to the unified realm. This wasn't just practical politics, but sophisticated statecraft that helped create a new Egyptian identity, transcending older regional loyalties. Chapter 2: The Old Kingdom and Pyramid Age. The unified Egypt that emerged under Narmer would soon transform into something the world had never seen before, a civilization capable of moving mountains literally. The Old Kingdom, stretching from roughly 3100 to 2181 BCE, became the age when humanity first learned to think big, really big, and then somehow convinced thousands of people to help make those enormous thoughts into stone reality. If the early dynastic period was Egypt's childhood, the Old Kingdom was its ambitious teenage years, complete with grandiose projects that probably seemed impossible until they were suddenly, undeniably there. Memphis, the gleaming capital established by the first pharaohs, had by now evolved into something approaching a metropolis. The ancient Egyptians called it Inebhedj, meaning white walls, probably referring to the brilliant whitewashed mud brick fortifications that surrounded the royal palace. Modern visitors might be disappointed to learn that ancient urban planning didn't include much in the way of surviving architecture. Most residential buildings were made of mud brick, which has the unfortunate habit of returning to mud given enough time and Nile floods. The transition from the early dynastic period to the Old Kingdom wasn't marked by conquest or revolution, but by an even more dramatic development: the emergence of truly centralized government. The pharaoh was no longer just a successful warlord who had managed to unite two rival kingdoms, but had transformed into something approaching a living god, complete with divine responsibilities that included ensuring the annual Nile flood arrived on schedule. This was either an impressive feat of ancient public relations or a genuine religious revolution, and probably both. The breakthrough moment came during the Third Dynasty, under a pharaoh named Djoser, whose architect Imhotep deserves recognition as history's first celebrity engineer. Imhotep's resume was impressive even by modern standards: royal architect, high priest, physician, and apparently wise enough that later generations would deify him and identify him with the Greek god of medicine. One imagines his business cards must have been quite crowded, though fortunately the ancient Egyptians hadn't invented business cards yet, which saved everyone considerable awkwardness. Imhotep's masterpiece was the step pyramid at Saqqara, completed around 2650 BCE, and it represented nothing less than a revolution in human thinking about what was possible. Previous royal tombs had been impressive but essentially horizontal elaborate mud brick structures called mastabas that sprawled across the desert floor. Imhotep took this traditional design and did something unprecedented. He stacked 6 of these mastabas on top of each other, creating a structure that rose 205 feet into the sky. It was humanity's first skyscraper, and like many architectural innovations, it probably started with someone saying, "What if we just built it higher?" The step pyramid wasn't just tall, it was the first monumental building made entirely of cut stone. Previous monuments had used mud brick, wood, and reed construction, materials that were practical but temporary. Stone was forever, or at least closer to forever than anything humans had previously attempted. The social implications were staggering. This single building required not just skilled stonemasons, but an entire support system of quarry workers, transporters, engineers, surveyors, and administrators. Egypt had essentially invented the construction industry. Djoser's success inspired his successors to think even bigger, which in ancient Egypt meant building even more impressive pyramids. The Fourth Dynasty, beginning around 2613 BCE, became the golden age of pyramid construction, when Egyptian engineering reached heights that would remain unsurpassed for thousands of years. This was the dynasty that gave us the 3 Great Pyramids of Giza, monuments so impressive that ancient Greek tourists would include them among the 7 wonders of the world. King Sneferu, the first pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty, approached pyramid building with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a new hobby. He commissioned not 1, not 2, but 3 complete pyramids during his reign, using more stone than any pharaoh before or after. His first attempt, the pyramid at Meidum, started as a step pyramid, but was later modified into a true pyramid, though the outer casing eventually collapsed, creating what modern tourists know as the one that didn't quite work out. Undeterred by this setback, Sneferu moved to Dashur and built the bent pyramid, which gets its name from a distinctive change in angle halfway up, as if the builders suddenly realized they were being overly ambitious and decided to play it safe. The result is a pyramid that looks like it's shrugging, which somehow makes it more endearing than intimidating. Sneferu's third pyramid, the Red Pyramid at Dashur, finally achieved the perfect pyramidal form that would become the gold standard for funerary architecture. But Sneferu's pyramid-building spree was merely preparation for what came next. His son Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, decided to outdo his father in the most spectacular way possible by building the largest pyramid ever constructed. The Great Pyramid of Giza, completed around 2560 BCE, stands 481 feet tall. When complete, each side measured 755 feet, making it a perfect square with proportions that still impress mathematicians and architects today. The statistics of the Great Pyramid are genuinely staggering. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. The precision of its construction defies easy explanation. The base is level to within just over 2 centimeters, and the sides are oriented to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that modern surveyors would be proud to achieve. The ancient Egyptians accomplished this using copper tools, wooden ramps, and rope, plus what must have been an unprecedented level of mathematical and engineering sophistication. Contrary to popular imagination, the workers were not slaves toiling under the whip, but paid workers who lived in purpose-built villages complete with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities. Archaeological evidence from the workers' cemetery shows that they received proper burials and medical care, including sophisticated treatment for broken bones, evidence that pyramid building, while dangerous, was considered honourable work worthy of respect and compensation. The organisation required for such projects reveals a level of administrative sophistication that rivals modern construction companies. Teams of workers were divided into gangs with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, suggesting that ancient project management understood the importance of team identity and possibly workplace. Social events. Supply chains stretched from the granite quarries of Aswan to the limestone quarries near Giza, requiring coordination of river transport and seasonal work schedules. Khufu's pyramid was quickly followed by those of his successors Khafre and Menkaure, creating the famous trio that still dominates the Giza plateau today. Khafre compensated for his slightly smaller pyramid by commissioning the Great Sphinx, a massive limestone sculpture that combines a human head with a lion's body and has been puzzling tourists for over 4,000 years. The third pyramid, built for Menkaure, is significantly smaller but makes up for its modest size with superior granite craftsmanship. But the Old Kingdom was about far more than impressive architecture. The period saw the development of a sophisticated social hierarchy that would define Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. At the apex stood the pharaoh, now firmly established as a living god whose divine nature was reinforced by elaborate rituals and increasingly complex religious ideology. The pharaoh was responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept the universe functioning properly. Directly below the pharaoh in the social pyramid stood the vizier, essentially the prime minister of ancient Egypt, who handled the day-to-day administration of the kingdom. The vizier's responsibilities were overwhelming: tax collection, judicial decisions, public works projects, military organization, and royal household management. It was a job that required someone capable of coordinating massive construction projects while simultaneously settling disputes between local governors. The noble class consisted of governors, high priests, and military commanders who managed Egypt's various provinces. Called nomes, priests held special significance in Old Kingdom society as they were responsible for maintaining the temples and performing the rituals necessary to keep the gods satisfied. This wasn't just religious observance but practical governance. If the gods became angry, the Nile might not flood, which would mean famine and political crisis. Below the elite classes came the skilled professionals who made Egyptian civilization function: Scribes held particularly high status because literacy was rare and valuable. They kept government records, calculated taxes, recorded legal proceedings, and maintained the vast archives necessary for administering a complex state. A career as a scribe offered one of the few paths for social mobility. A farmer's son who learned to read and write could potentially rise to positions of real authority within the government bureaucracy. Artisans and craftsmen created the beautiful objects that filled Egyptian tombs and temples. Carpenters, jewelers, metalworkers, painters, sculptors, and potters all contributed to the material culture that made Egyptian civilization distinctive. Many worked in government workshops, creating objects for the pharaoh and nobles, while others operated private businesses serving the emerging middle class. The foundation of Egyptian society remained the agricultural workforce, farmers, herders, and rural labourers who produced the food that supported everyone else. Egyptian agriculture was remarkably productive thanks to the annual Nile flood, but it still required intensive human labour. Farmers worked land owned by the pharaoh, nobles, or temples, typically keeping a portion of their produce while contributing the remainder as taxes or rent. Daily life for most Egyptians during the Old Kingdom revolved around work, family, and community activities. Housing varied significantly based on social class, from elaborate noble residences with gardens and pools to simple farmers' structures with just a few rooms. Everyone, regardless of class, paid close attention to cleanliness and personal grooming. Egyptians bathed regularly, shaved their heads to prevent lice, and wore makeup both for beauty and sun protection. Clothing was remarkably uniform across social classes, with most people wearing simple linen garments. Men typically wore kilts, while women wore straight dresses. The quality of the linen and jewellery indicated social status more than the basic clothing design. Most people went barefoot, though sandals were available for special occasions. The Egyptian diet was based on bread, beer, vegetables, and fish, with meat being a luxury reserved for special occasions or the wealthy. Bread served as the staple food for all classes, while beer was the standard beverage safer than water and nutritious enough to constitute a significant portion of daily calories. The Nile provided abundant fish, while vegetables included onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, and various legumes. Entertainment and leisure activities were important aspects of Old Kingdom life. Sports included wrestling, swimming, and various ball games, while board games like Senet provided indoor entertainment. Music and dancing were popular at all social levels, while religious festivals provided community celebration and broke the routine of daily work. Religion permeated every aspect of Egyptian life, but it wasn't the gloomy, death-obsessed system often portrayed in popular media. Egyptian religion was practical and optimistic, focused on maintaining cosmic order and ensuring good fortune in both this life and the next. The gods were numerous and diverse, with different deities responsible for different aspects of life. Ptah for craftsmanship, Sobek for the Nile's fertility, Thoth for wisdom and writing. Yet for all its achievements, the Old Kingdom contained the seeds of its own eventual decline. The massive resources devoted to pyramid construction represented an enormous economic burden. The provincial nobility gradually accumulated more power and autonomy, weakening central authority. Climate change may have contributed to irregularities in the Nile flood, creating agricultural crises. By the end of the 6th dynasty, around 2181 BCE, these pressures would converge to bring the Old Kingdom to an end. At its height, the Old Kingdom represented humanity's first great experiment in organized civilization on a massive scale. The pyramids that still dominate the horizon, near modern Cairo, stand as eternal testimony to what human ambition and organization could accomplish. Most importantly, the Old Kingdom established patterns of government, art, religion, and social organization that would define Egyptian civilization for the next 2,500 years, creating a legacy that continues to fascinate and inspire us today. Chapter 3: Middle Kingdom through New Kingdom Glory. As the Old Kingdom crumbled under the weight of its own ambitious pyramid projects and increasingly powerful provincial governors, Egypt ascended into what historians diplomatically call the First Intermediate Period, essentially a century-and-a-half experiment in whether ancient civilizations could function without strong central government. Spoiler alert, they could not. Around 2055 BCE, however, a determined prince from the southern city of Thebes decided that Egypt had suffered quite enough political chaos and set about reunifying the country through systematic military conquest. This prince, Mentuhotep II, became the hero of Egyptian reunification and earned the title Second Menes for recreating the unified kingdom that the first pharaohs had established over 1,000 years earlier. His path to power wasn't immediate. The Theban rulers had been gradually expanding their influence northward for decades, fighting a protracted conflict against the rival Heracleopolitan kingdom that controlled Middle and Lower Egypt. Unlike his predecessors, who had ruled from Memphis in the north, Mentuhotep made Thebes the new capital of Egypt, marking the first time a southern city had controlled the entire country. This geographic shift represented a fundamental rebalancing of Egyptian power that elevated the previously minor god Amun to national prominence and established a pattern of southern rule that would define the next phase of Egyptian civilization. The Middle Kingdom that Mentuhotep founded lasted from roughly 2055 to 1650 BCE and represented Egypt's classical age, a time when the civilization achieved a sophisticated balance between central authority and provincial autonomy. The period saw the development of more realistic royal portraiture, replacing the idealized god-kings of the Old Kingdom with rulers who looked recognizably human. Mentuhotep II's reunification strategy involved convincing former enemies to become loyal supporters while preventing former allies from becoming new enemies. He accomplished this through diplomatic marriages, strategic appointments, and allowing provincial governors to maintain their positions if they demonstrated appropriate loyalty. Those who proved unreliable found their responsibilities transferred to more trustworthy Theban officials. The most successful phase of the Middle Kingdom came under the 12th dynasty, when a vizier named Amenemhat managed what was essentially a successful coup, establishing his own royal line and moving the capital to a new city called Ichtawi, Caesar of the Two Lands, strategically located between Memphis and Thebes. This name showed impressive confidence, though given Amenemhat's subsequent 45-year reign, he apparently had good reason for it. Amenemhat I's reign established several innovations that would become standard practice. He instituted the practice of co-regency, appointing his son as junior pharaoh during his lifetime to ensure smooth succession. He also strengthened Egypt's borders through military campaigns and fortress construction, while developing propaganda literature that portrayed him as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. The 12th dynasty pharaohs, particularly Senusret III, perfected political consolidation by systematically reducing the power of provincial governors while expanding Egyptian territory far into Nubia. Senusret III became known as a warrior king who personally led his troops into battle and established massive fortresses along the Nile to control trade routes and protect Egypt's southern border. The Middle Kingdom also witnessed remarkable advances in Egyptian culture and technology. Literature flourished, producing classics like The Story of Sinuhe, which tells of an Egyptian courtier's adventures in foreign lands. Mathematical papyri demonstrate sophisticated understanding of geometry and algebra, while medical texts show advanced knowledge of surgery and pharmaceuticals. Trade networks expanded dramatically during the Middle Kingdom, reaching from the Mediterranean to Central Africa and bringing unprecedented wealth to Egypt. The pharaohs established formal diplomatic relations with other kingdoms, exchanged ambassadors, and arranged royal marriages that created international alliances. Egyptian expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt returned with exotic goods including gold, ivory, incense, and live animals. Unfortunately, success bred complacency, and by the end of the 12th dynasty, the central authority began to weaken as the royal family experienced succession crises and provincial governors gradually reasserted their independence. The 13th dynasty saw rapid turnover of rulers, some reigning for only a few months, while local governors rebuilt autonomous power bases. This political fragmentation created the perfect opportunity for foreign intervention. Around 1650 BCE, a group from the Levant known as the Hyksos established control over Lower Egypt, initiating what Egyptians would remember as one of the most traumatic periods in their history. The Hyksos, whose name probably means rulers of foreign lands, weren't necessarily the barbarian invaders that later Egyptian propaganda portrayed them as. They adopted Egyptian royal titles, worshipped Egyptian gods, and maintained many Egyptian administrative practices while introducing technological innovations that would revolutionize ancient warfare. What made them foreign was their advanced military technology, horse-drawn chariots and composite bows that gave them decisive advantages over traditional Egyptian infantry. The Hyksos period, known as the Second Intermediate Period, lasted roughly a century and created what modern military strategists would recognize as a classic asymmetric warfare situation. The technologically superior Hyksos controlled Lower Egypt from their capital at Avaris in the Delta, while native Egyptian dynasties maintained independence in Upper Egypt around Thebes. The two sides coexisted uneasily, with Egyptian rulers probably paying tribute to the Hyksos while slowly learning their military innovations and plotting revenge that would require generations to achieve. That revenge came under Ahmose I, who around 1550 BCE launched a systematic campaign to expel the Hyksos and reunify Egypt under native rule through military campaigns that demonstrated Egyptian mastery of the new technologies. Ahmose had learned his military lessons well. His forces used horse-drawn chariots, composite bows, and bronze weapons that matched or exceeded Hyksos capabilities, while combining these innovations with traditional Egyptian advantages in organization and logistics. After capturing Avaris and pursuing the Hyksos into southern Palestine, Ahmose established the 18th dynasty and initiated what would become known as the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom, lasting from approximately 1550 to 1077 BCE, transformed Egypt from a regional power into a genuine empire that controlled territory from the Fourth Cataract in Nubia to the Euphrates River in Syria. This expansion was driven partly by the trauma of foreign occupation. Never again would Egypt allow threats to develop on its borders, and partly by the opportunities created by Egyptian mastery of new military technologies that enabled power projection over vast distances. The early New Kingdom reached its zenith under the remarkable pharaoh Hatshepsut, who ruled for approximately 22 years during the 15th century BCE and represents one of history's most successful female rulers. Hatshepsut faced the unprecedented challenge of claiming divine kingship in a culture that traditionally reserved that role for men, requiring political innovations that would influence concepts of royal authority for centuries afterward. Her solution was typically Egyptian. She adopted full royal regalia, including the traditional false beard of kingship, while emphasizing her role as the chosen earthly representative of the gods. Hatshepsut's reign was marked by prosperity, extensive trade, and massive building projects rather than military conquest, representing a conscious choice to focus on economic development and cultural achievement. She commissioned trading expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt that returned with such exotic wealth that their arrival became the subject of detailed carved reliefs. Her architectural achievements included the stunning terrace temple at Deir el-Bahri, built into the cliffs near Thebes, and considered one of the masterpieces of ancient architecture that influenced Egyptian temple design for centuries. Following Hatshepsut's death, her stepson Thutmose III assumed power and immediately began the military campaigns that would earn him the nickname Egypt's Napoleon through 17 successful expeditions that established Egyptian control over Palestine, Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia. His victory at the Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BCE became the template for ancient siege warfare, combining tactical innovation with excellent logistic support. Thutmose III's military success represented a revolution in how ancient states could project power over vast distances through coordinated supply chains, diplomatic intelligence networks, and administrative systems capable of governing diverse populations. The wealth generated by empire transformed Egyptian society and culture in profound ways that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of New Kingdom civilization. The 18th dynasty pharaohs commissioned art and architecture on a scale that rivaled the Old Kingdom pyramid builders, but with far greater sophistication and international influences. The famous tomb paintings in the Valley of the Kings showcase artistic techniques that incorporated styles learned from contact with Mesopotamian, Mediterranean, and African cultures, creating a distinctive imperial aesthetic. Perhaps no ruler better embodied the cultural confidence of New Kingdom Egypt than Amenhotep III, who ruled during the 14th century BCE at the absolute height of Egyptian power and prosperity. Amenhotep III received tribute from rulers across the known world, maintained diplomatic correspondence with kings from Mesopotamia to the Aegean, and commissioned more statuary than any pharaoh in history, while developing artistic programs that celebrated Egyptian achievement and international dominance. This golden age reached its most fascinating phase under Amenhotep III's son, who initially ruled as Amenhotep IV, but eventually changed his name to Akhenaten in honor of the sun god Aten. Akhenaten launched what historians consider the world's first attempt at monotheistic religion, abandoning the traditional Egyptian pantheon in favor of exclusive worship of Aten, represented as the solar disk. This represented either a remarkable spiritual breakthrough or the ancient world's most expensive midlife crisis, depending on one's perspective on religious reform. Akhenaten's religious revolution extended far beyond theology into art, literature, and urban planning that created an entirely new aesthetic and cultural program. He abandoned traditional royal capitals and built an entirely new city called Akhetaten Modern Amarna, designed specifically for Aten worship. The art of the period broke dramatically with traditional Egyptian conventions, showing the royal family with elongated heads and informal poses that emphasized their humanity rather than divine perfection, creating some of the most expressive art in Egyptian history. The Amarna period's cultural achievements came at the cost of political stability, as Akhenaten's focus on religious reform diverted attention from governing the empire. While Akhenaten concentrated on theological innovation, Egyptian territories in Syria and Palestine gradually slipped away as local rulers realized that the pharaoh was too distracted to enforce his authority. The famous Amarna letters reveal increasingly desperate pleas from Egyptian vassals requesting military support that never arrived, creating the ancient equivalent of being abandoned by your most important ally. Akhenaten's reign ended in confusion that was resolved only when his young son Tutankhamun assumed power and reversed most of his father's innovations through a comprehensive restoration program. Tutankhamun restored traditional religious practices, moved the capital back to Thebes, and attempted to rebuild Egypt's international relationships, though his reign was too brief to fully accomplish these goals. His early death ensured his fame more for his spectacular burial goods than his political achievements. though his tomb provides invaluable insights into New Kingdom royal culture. The 19th dynasty marked Egypt's final period of international dominance under rulers who adopted the name Ramesses and represented a conscious attempt to restore Egyptian greatness through military conquest and monumental construction. The greatest of these pharaohs, Ramesses II, ruled for 67 years and became the template for Egyptian royal power. Ramesses II fought the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire, proclaiming it as a great victory despite what was probably a tactical draw that achieved strategic goals by establishing clear spheres of influence. Ramesses II's building projects rivaled those of any pharaoh in history and created monuments that still dominate the landscape of modern Egypt. His rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel, with their massive seated figures carved directly from cliff faces, represented both artistic mastery and political propaganda, designed to intimidate Egypt's southern neighbours. The temples were positioned so that twice yearly the rising sun would penetrate the inner sanctuary and illuminate statues of the pharaoh alongside the gods, creating a divine light show that combined religious symbolism with royal propaganda. The New Kingdom's prosperity made it an attractive target for the mysterious Sea Peoples coalition forces who appeared in the eastern Mediterranean during the 13th and 12th centuries BCE and attacked established kingdoms throughout the region. Egypt faced these invasions under Ramses III, who successfully defended the country through land and sea battles but at enormous cost in resources and manpower. The invasions marked the beginning of a broader collapse of Bronze Age civilizations, ending the international system that had supported Egyptian imperial expansion. The later New Kingdom saw gradual decline as climate change, economic pressure, and internal political conflicts weakened central authority. The last effective pharaoh, Ramesses XI, found his power challenged by the high priests of Amun at Thebes, who had accumulated enormous wealth and began functioning as independent rulers. This division of authority marked the end of unified pharaonic rule and initiated the Third Intermediate Period, when Egypt once again fragmented into competing political units that struggled to maintain Egyptian independence while attempting to preserve the cultural achievements of earlier periods. Yet even in decline, the achievements of the Middle and New Kingdoms established patterns that would define Egyptian civilization for the remaining 2 millennia of its existence. The artistic styles, architectural forms, religious concepts, and administrative practices developed during these periods provided templates that subsequent rulers would follow, even when they lacked the resources to match their predecessors' accomplishments, while the imperial identity created during the New Kingdom would continue to influence Egyptian political ambitions throughout subsequent history. Chapter 4: Foreign Rule and Decline. The death of Ramesses XI in 1077 BCE marked not just the end of the New Kingdom, but the beginning of what would become ancient Egypt's most prolonged experiment in political fragmentation, a 1,000-year journey through foreign rule, brief revivals, and gradual cultural transformation that would fundamentally reshape Egyptian civilization. Unlike the previous intermediate periods, which had been temporary disruptions before Egyptian renewal, this era would witness the permanent end of native pharaonic rule and Egypt's transformation into a succession of imperial provinces, each leaving its mark on the country's evolving identity. The Third Intermediate Period began with what historians might call a constitutional crisis that would make modern political scientists weep with recognition. The high priests of Amun at Thebes had gradually accumulated so much wealth and power that they effectively controlled Upper Egypt independently, owning 2/3 of all temple lands, 90% of Egypt's ships, and enough resources to challenge pharaonic authority directly. Meanwhile, the 21st dynasty pharaohs ruled from Tanis in the delta, creating a divided kingdom where religious and political authority existed in an uneasy balance that occasionally erupted into open conflict, but more often resembled a tense family dinner where everyone pretends everything is fine. The first phase of this divided rule actually worked surprisingly well, demonstrating that ancient Egyptians could be remarkably pragmatic when survival required cooperation. The Tanite pharaohs and Theban priests maintained cordial relations through strategic marriages, shared appointments, and the kind of diplomatic courtesy that suggested both sides understood their mutual dependence. This cooperation allowed Egyptian culture to continue developing, producing some of the finest literature and art of the later pharaonic period, while maintaining trade networks that connected Egypt to the broader Mediterranean world. However, this delicate balance couldn't survive the arrival of new players who had been watching Egypt's internal divisions with the calculating interest of wolves observing a wounded deer. Around 943 BCE, a powerful family of Libyan descent led by Shoshenq managed to reunite Egypt under the 22nd dynasty, bringing together Lower and Upper Egypt through a combination of military strength, political marriages, and the diplomatic skills that successful conquerors have always required when taking over sophisticated civilizations. Shoshenq I became the biblical Shishak, famous for sacking Jerusalem during the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam, demonstrating that Egypt could still project power beyond its borders when properly organized. The Libyan dynasties represented something entirely new in Egyptian history, foreign rulers who genuinely embraced Egyptian culture rather than simply exploiting it. Unlike previous invaders, the Libyans adopted Egyptian names, worshipped Egyptian gods, and followed pharaonic traditions with the enthusiasm of converts who had found their spiritual homeland. This cultural adoption created a unique period of synthesis where traditional Egyptian practices continued alongside Libyan innovations, producing art and architecture that combined familiar forms with fresh perspectives. For over a century, this Libyan-Egyptian synthesis brought stability and prosperity to the country, allowing trade to flourish and temples to be restored while maintaining the cultural patterns that connected contemporary Egyptians to their pharaonic heritage. The Libyan pharaohs proved particularly adept at balancing competing regional interests, appointing family members to key positions while respecting local traditions and maintaining the religious institutions that provided continuity with Egypt's glorious past. Unfortunately, success in ancient politics often contained the seeds of its own destruction, and by the mid-9th century BCE, the centralized Libyan state began fragmenting into competing dynasties as regional governors gradually asserted independence and rival claimants emerged to challenge royal authority. This fragmentation created what modern historians politely call the 23rd dynasty, but which was really a collection of semi-independent city-states ruled by ambitious local strongmen who maintained the fiction of pharaonic legitimacy while pursuing their own territorial and economic interests. Civil war erupted in Thebes as competing factions fought for control of the city's religious and economic resources, creating the kind of protracted conflict that weakens everyone involved while providing opportunities for outside intervention. The warfare continued for decades, destroying much of the unity that earlier Libyan rulers had achieved, and leaving Egypt divided between multiple competing authorities who spent more energy fighting each other than defending the country from external threats. This division proved irresistible to Egypt's southern neighbours, the Nubian kingdoms of Kush, who had been patiently building their own power base while Egyptian attention focused on internal conflicts. Under King Kashta, the Nubians began extending their influence into Upper Egypt through the brilliant strategy of religious infiltration, having his daughter Amenerdis appointed as God's wife of Amun, effectively giving Nubia control over Thebes' religious establishment and the enormous wealth that accompanied these positions. Kashta's son Piye completed the Nubian conquest around 732 BCE through military campaigns that demonstrated superior organization, equipment, and leadership compared to the divided Egyptian forces opposing him. Piet's victory stele reveals a ruler who understood both the practical requirements of conquest and the psychological importance of legitimacy. He portrayed his campaigns as a divine mission to restore proper religious observance, political order to Egypt, while respecting traditional pharaonic customs and institutions. The 25th dynasty that Piet established created what was essentially a Nubian Egyptian empire that stretched from the Fourth Cataract to the Mediterranean, ruling a territory larger than Egypt had controlled since the height of the New Kingdom. The Nubian pharaohs brought remarkable energy to their adopted kingdom, launching ambitious building projects, restoring temples, and commissioning the first pyramid construction in Egypt for centuries, while maintaining their own cultural capital at Napata in Sudan. Under Taharqa, the most celebrated of the Nubian pharaohs, Egypt experienced what historians call a renaissance in art, architecture, and international influence. Taharqa commissioned spectacular building projects at Karnak, created innovative artistic programs that combined Nubian and Egyptian traditions, and led successful military campaigns that restored Egyptian influence in Palestine and Syria. His reign demonstrated that effective leadership could still mobilize Egypt's resources for impressive achievements when political will and administrative competence aligned. However, this Nubian revival coincided with the rise of the Assyrian Empire, which had been systematically conquering the ancient Near East and viewed Egypt's renewed strength as an unacceptable threat to Assyrian regional dominance. The technological and organizational advantages that had allowed Assyria to defeat other ancient kingdoms proved equally effective against Egypt's iron weapons, siege engines, professional armies, and administrative systems that could coordinate complex military operations over vast distances. The Assyrian invasions under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal devastated Egypt between 671 and 663 BCE, culminating in the sack of Thebes that ended over a millennium of the city's prominence as a center of Egyptian civilization. The psychological impact of Thebes' destruction cannot be overstated. This was equivalent to burning Rome or Paris, eliminating not just a political capital but a religious and cultural center that embodied Egyptian identity and continuity. After driving the Nubians back to Sudan, the Assyrians faced the perennial imperial challenge of controlling Egypt from a distance while managing threats elsewhere. Their solution involved appointing local rulers as vassal kings, particularly the 26th dynasty based in Sais, who were expected to collect tribute and maintain order, while the Assyrian military focused on other frontiers. This arrangement worked reasonably well until Assyrian power began declining in the early 6th century BCE. Psamtik I, the founder of the Saite 26th dynasty, proved remarkably adept at the delicate transition from Assyrian puppet to independent ruler, gradually asserting Egyptian autonomy while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that might provoke massive retaliation. Using Greek and Lydian mercenaries to supplement Egyptian forces, Psamtik reunified Egypt and initiated what became known as the Saite Renaissance, a conscious revival of Old Kingdom and New Kingdom artistic and architectural forms that emphasized Egypt's glorious past while addressing contemporary challenges. The Saite period represented the last sustained attempt to restore genuinely Egyptian rule, and for nearly 140 years, the 26th dynasty pharaohs achieved remarkable success in reviving Egyptian prosperity, culture, and international influence. They built or restored temples throughout the country, commissioned spectacular art that consciously imitated earlier masterpieces, and maintained trade relationships that connected Egypt to the broader Mediterranean world while preserving the cultural institutions that defined Egyptian civilization. Site pharaohs like Necho II launched ambitious projects, including attempts to build a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, demonstrating the kind of engineering vision that recalled Egypt's greatest periods while serving contemporary strategic and economic needs. They also formed alliances with other Mediterranean powers, created formal diplomatic relationships with Greek city-states, and established trading colonies that spread Egyptian influence while importing foreign technologies and ideas. Unfortunately, the Site revival occurred during the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great and his successors, who viewed Egypt's wealth and strategic location as essential additions to their growing dominion. The Persian conquest in 525 BCE under Cambyses II ended Egyptian independence permanently, incorporating the country into an imperial system that would persist in various forms until the 20th century of the Common Era. Persian rule, formalized as the 27th dynasty, introduced Egypt to genuine foreign administration for the first time in its 3,000-year history. Unlike previous conquerors who had adopted Egyptian customs and ruled as pharaohs, the Persians governed through appointed governors called satraps, who remained fundamentally foreign in their outlook and administrative methods. While early Persian rulers like Darius built temples and showed respect for Egyptian religion, later rulers proved less accommodating, imposing heavy taxation and occasionally suppressing Egyptian cultural practices. The Persian period witnessed frequent rebellions as Egyptian nationalism clashed with imperial administration, creating cycles of revolt and repression that weakened both Persian control and Egyptian prosperity. These uprisings occasionally succeeded in establishing brief periods of native rule under dynasties, 28 through 30, but these revivals proved temporary against the overwhelming resources that Persian and later Macedonian empires could mobilize for reconquest. Alexander the Great's conquest in 332 BCE began Egypt's incorporation into the Hellenistic world, replacing Persian administration with Macedonian leadership that proved more successful at balancing foreign rule with Egyptian traditions. Alexander's visit to the oracle at Siwa, where he was declared son of Amun, demonstrated the diplomatic intelligence that would characterize successful foreign rule in Egypt, respecting religious traditions while asserting political authority. The Ptolemaic kingdom, established by Alexander's general Ptolemy I Sota, lasted for nearly 3 centuries and represented the most successful synthesis of foreign rule and Egyptian culture in the country's history. The Ptolemies ruled as pharaohs, built temples, sponsored Egyptian religious practices, and created a unique Greco-Egyptian civilization centered on Alexandria that became the intellectual and cultural capital of the Hellenistic world. Alexandria under the Ptolemies rivaled Athens as a center of learning and culture, housing the famous library and museum that attracted scholars from throughout the Mediterranean world. The city's lighthouse became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, while its harbour served as the primary connection between Egyptian wealth and Hellenistic trade networks that stretched from Spain to India. However, Ptolemaic Egypt gradually weakened through dynastic conflicts, economic pressures, and the rising power of Rome, which increasingly intervened in Egyptian politics, while Egyptian rulers struggled to maintain independence through diplomatic marriages, military alliances, and financial arrangements that ultimately compromised their autonomy. The famous Cleopatra VII represented the last attempt to restore Ptolemaic power through alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE and Cleopatra's subsequent suicide ended Ptolemaic rule and began the Roman period, when Egypt became the personal province of Augustus and his imperial successors. Roman administration proved remarkably efficient at extracting Egyptian wealth while maintaining the administrative and cultural systems that kept the country productive, turning Egypt into the breadbasket of the empire that fed Rome's 1 million inhabitants. Roman Egypt flourished economically, while Egyptian culture adapted to imperial requirements, creating unique artistic and religious syntheses that combine traditional pharaonic forms with Roman imperial iconography. Egyptian temples continued functioning with Roman support, while traditional religious practices evolved to incorporate imperial cult worship and Roman legal systems. The rise of Christianity fundamentally transformed Egyptian society during the later Roman period, as the new religion provided both spiritual comfort for oppressed populations and institutional structures that could survive political upheavals. Coptic Christianity developed its own distinctive character that preserved elements of traditional Egyptian culture within Christian theological frameworks, creating religious institutions that outlasted Roman political control. When the Roman Empire divided in 395 CE, Egypt became part of the Byzantine Empire centered in Constantinople, maintaining political and economic connections to the Greco-Roman world, while developing increasingly distinct cultural characteristics that reflected its position between Mediterranean and African civilizations. The Arab conquest in 641 CE finally ended over 9 centuries of Greco-Roman rule, beginning Egypt's incorporation into the Islamic world and marking the definitive end of the pharaonic tradition that had defined Egyptian civilization for over 3 millennia. Yet even this dramatic transition demonstrated the underlying continuity of Egyptian adaptability, the same qualities that had allowed the country to absorb Libyan, Nubian, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and Roman influences while maintaining its essential character would prove equally valuable in the Islamic period that followed. Chapter 5: Islamic Egypt and Medieval Period. The thunderous hoofbeats of Arab cavalry echoing across the Sinai Peninsula in 641 CE announced more than just another military campaign. They heralded the beginning of Egypt's transformation into one of the Islamic world's greatest centers of learning, culture, and political power. When Amr ibn al-As led his remarkably small force of 4,000 troops across the desert from Palestine, he was launching what would prove to be one of history's most successful conquests, fundamentally reshaping the religious, cultural, and political landscape of a civilization that had endured for over 3 millennia. The speed and decisiveness of the Arab conquest would have impressed even Alexander the Great, though Amr ibn al-As had several advantages that the Macedonian conqueror had lacked. Byzantine Egypt was exhausted by decades of war with Persia, overtaxed by imperial demands, and divided by religious conflicts between the Orthodox establishment and the Coptic Christian majority who had suffered under imperial persecution. When Arab forces offered the traditional choice of conversion, tribute, or battle, many Egyptians viewed the newcomers not as foreign invaders, but as potential liberators from Byzantine oppression. The fortress of Babylon, strategically positioned where Cairo now stands, fell to Amr's forces in 641 after a siege that demonstrated both Arab military competence and Byzantine demoralization. The Arabs had learned their lessons from previous campaigns in Syria and Palestine, combining superior mobility with diplomatic intelligence that turned local grievances into military advantages. When the great city of Alexandria finally surrendered in 642, it marked the end of nearly 7 centuries of Greco-Roman rule and the beginning of Egypt's integration into the rapidly expanding Islamic Empire. Amr ibn al-As proved as capable an administrator as he was a general, establishing policies that would define Islamic rule in Egypt for centuries to come. Rather than attempting wholesale cultural transformation, he allowed existing administrative structures to continue functioning while gradually introducing Islamic law and practices. Christian and Jewish communities received dhimmi status, guaranteeing protection of life and property in exchange for the jizya tax, while conversion to Islam remained voluntary rather than coerced. The establishment of Fustat as Egypt's new capital represented more than administrative convenience. It embodied the Islamic principle of creating distinct Muslim communities while respecting existing populations. Built near the old Roman fortress but designed according to Arab urban planning principles, Fustat became the first Islamic city in Egypt and served as a model for the gradual Islamization that would transform Egyptian society over the following centuries. For the first 2 centuries of Islamic rule, Egypt remained primarily a province of the expanding Umayyad and later Abbasid caliphates, valued for its agricultural wealth and strategic position but governed by appointed officials rather than independent rulers. The country's grain production continued feeding distant capitals, first Damascus, then Baghdad, while Egyptian artisans, merchants and scholars gradually adopted Arabic language and Islamic cultural practices. This period of gradual transformation accelerated dramatically in 969, when the Fatimid dynasty conquered Egypt and established what would become one of the Islamic world's most remarkable political and cultural achievements. The Fatimids were Shia Muslims who claimed descent from Fatima, the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, and their conquest represented far more than a simple change of dynasty. It marked Egypt's emergence as the center of an independent Islamic empire that would challenge the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate for religious and political leadership. The Fatimid general Jahar al-Sakili founded a new capital city north of Fustat called Al-Qahira the Victorious, which gave its name to modern Cairo and was designed to rival Baghdad as a center of Islamic civilization. The city's planning reflected Fatimid ambitions and religious beliefs, featuring magnificent palaces, sophisticated infrastructure, and most importantly, the Mosque University of Al-Azhar, which was destined to become one of the Islamic world's most influential centers of religious learning. Al-Azhar University, established in 970, represented revolutionary innovation in Islamic education, combining traditional religious instruction with the study of philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and other sciences. Named after Fatima al-Zahra, in honor of the dynasty's claimed ancestry, the institution attracted scholars from across the Islamic world and developed teaching methods that influenced educational practices throughout the medieval period. Under Fatimid rule, Egypt experienced what historians call its Islamic Golden Age, a period when the country became a major center of trade, learning, and artistic achievement while serving as the capital of an empire that stretched from North Africa to Syria. The Fatimids developed extensive commercial networks that connected Mediterranean markets with Indian Ocean trade routes, making Cairo one of the world's wealthiest cities and a cosmopolitan center where merchants, scholars, and diplomats from across the known world gathered. The Fatimid court became legendary for its luxury, sophistication, and cultural patronage, supporting poets, artists, scientists, and architects who created some of the Islamic world's finest achievements. The dynasty's religious tolerance allowed Christian, Jewish, and Sunni Muslim communities to flourish alongside Shia institutions, creating a pluralistic society that encouraged intellectual exchange and cultural innovation. However, the Fatimid Empire gradually weakened during the 11th and 12th centuries as military expenses mounted, succession disputes divided the ruling family, and external threats from crusaders and rival Muslim powers strained the dynasty's resources. The arrival of crusader armies in the eastern Mediterranean created military pressures that required expensive campaigns and defensive preparations. The end of Fatimid rule came not through external conquest but through internal collapse, when the Kurdish general Salah al-Din Saladin arrived in Egypt as part of a Syrian intervention in 1269 and gradually assumed control of the country. In 1171, Saladin formally abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, restored Egypt to Sunni orthodoxy, and established the Ayyubid dynasty that would rule Egypt and Syria for nearly a century, while conducting the most famous campaigns of the crusading period. Saladin's establishment of the Ayyubid dynasty marked Egypt's transformation from a center of sheer power into the champion of Sunni Islam's struggle against the Crusader states. Saladin proved remarkably skilled at managing the transition, retaining many Fatimid administrative practices while gradually introducing Sunni religious institutions and replacing Shia officials with Sunni appointees who shared his vision of Islamic unity against Christian invasion. The Ayyubid period witnessed Egypt's emergence as the Muslim world's primary defender against Crusader expansion, a role that brought enormous prestige but also required massive military expenditures and constant warfare. Saladin's victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and subsequent recapture of Jerusalem made him a hero throughout the Islamic world, while his reputation for chivalry and honor earned respect even from his Christian opponents. Under Ayyubid rule, Cairo became a center of Sunni scholarship and religious instruction, with numerous madrasas established to train scholars in orthodox Islamic learning. Al-Azhar University was transformed from a center of Shia learning into a bastion of Sunni orthodoxy, though it retained its international reputation for scholarly excellence and continued attracting students from across the Islamic world. However, the Ayyubid system contained inherent weaknesses that gradually undermined dynastic stability. Saladin's practice of dividing the empire among family members as autonomous principalities created competing centers of power, while the dynasty's reliance on professional soldiers called Mamluks, initially purchased as slaves but trained as elite cavalry, eventually provided these military men with the organization and capability to challenge their masters directly. The Mamluk Revolution of 1250 marked another dramatic transformation in Egyptian governance, though one that maintained continuity with earlier Islamic institutions while introducing innovations that would prove remarkably durable. When Mamluk officers assassinated the last Ayyubid sultan and elevated Shajar al-Dur, the sultan's widow, to the throne, they were establishing a precedent for military control of government that would persist for over 2.5 centuries. The Mamluk system represented a unique solution to the challenge of maintaining military effectiveness while preventing military rebellions. Young men, primarily from Turkish and later Circassian backgrounds, were purchased as slaves, converted to Islam, and trained intensively in military arts, legal studies, and administrative skills before being freed and incorporated into the military hierarchy. This process created intensely loyal military units with no local family ties that might compromise their service to the state. Under sultans like Baybars and Kalawun, the Mamluks achieved military success that surpassed even Saladin's accomplishments, completing the expulsion of Crusader states from the eastern Mediterranean, while simultaneously defeating Mongol invasions that had devastated much of the Islamic world. The Mamluk victory at Ain Jalut in 1260 halted the Mongol advance toward Egypt, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, establishing the Mamluks as defenders of Islam against the greatest military threat the medieval world had ever seen. Cairo under Mamluk rule became the largest city in the medieval world outside China, with a population that may have exceeded 500,000 inhabitants and commercial activity that connected European markets with Asian trade networks. The city's markets, workshops, and financial institutions handled much of the international trade between East and West, while Mamluk control of the Red Sea routes to India provided enormous revenues. The Mamluk period witnessed a remarkable flowering of Islamic architecture, scholarship, and artistic achievement that reflected both the dynasty's military success and its commitment to Islamic learning and culture. The sultans commissioned magnificent mosques, madrasas, hospitals, and other public buildings that demonstrated Islamic architectural innovation while providing practical services to urban populations. Mamluk support for Islamic scholarship restored and enhanced Egypt's reputation as a center of learning, with Al-Azhar University experiencing renewed growth and influence under generous royal patronage. the university attracted distinguished scholars from across the Islamic world, including such luminaries as Ibn Khaldun, whose groundbreaking work in historiography and social science was written while he served at the Mamluk court. However, Mamluk society's military focus created structural problems that became increasingly serious over time, particularly as changing military technology and international economic patterns reduced the effectiveness of traditional cavalry warfare and the profitability of overland trade routes. The discovery of sea routes around Africa by Portuguese navigators in the late 15th century undermined Egypt's strategic position as the primary link between European and Asian markets. More immediately threatening was the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which had mastered the use of gunpowder weapons and artillery that proved devastatingly effective against traditional Mamluk cavalry tactics. When Ottoman Sultan Selim I invaded Mamluk territory in 1516, his armies possessed technological and tactical advantages that the Mamluks could not counter effectively, despite their superior knowledge of local terrain. The Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517 ended nearly 9 centuries of Egypt's independence under various Islamic dynasties and incorporated the country into an empire centered in Istanbul that would control Egyptian affairs for the next 3 centuries. Sultan Selim I's victory represented not just military success but the triumph of new military technologies and administrative systems over traditional methods. Yet the Islamic period from 641 to 1517 had fundamentally transformed Egypt in ways that would persist long after political control shifted to Istanbul. The country had become thoroughly integrated into the Islamic world, with Arabic as its primary language, Islam as its majority religion, and Islamic law and culture as the foundations of social organization. Cairo had established itself as one of the Islamic world's great centers of learning and culture. The architectural legacy of Islamic Egypt, from the Mosque of Amr ibn al-As through Fatimid palaces and Ayyubid fortifications to Mamluk mosques and madrasas, created an urban landscape that embodied nearly 9 centuries of Islamic civilization and artistic achievement. These buildings served not merely as historical monuments, but as functioning institutions that continued providing religious, educational, and social services to Egyptian communities. The intellectual contributions of Islamic Egypt proved equally enduring, as institutions like Al-Azhar University and scholars trained in Egyptian madrasas continued influencing Islamic thought and practice throughout the Muslim world. The legal traditions, theological interpretations, and educational methods developed during this period provided foundations for Islamic scholarship that remained influential long after political circumstances changed. The Islamic transformation of Egypt demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of both Islamic and Egyptian cultures, creating a synthesis that preserved essential elements of pharaonic heritage while embracing new religious, linguistic, and cultural traditions that connected Egypt to a community stretching from Spain to Southeast Asia. This synthesis would prove resilient enough to survive subsequent political changes, while providing the cultural foundation for Egypt's continuing role as a major center of Arabic and Islamic civilization. Chapter 6: Modern Egypt. The Ottoman cannons that thundered across the Egyptian landscape in 1517 announced not merely the conquest of another province, but the beginning of Egypt's long and complex journey toward modern nationhood, a journey that would transform a medieval Islamic society into a contemporary republic while preserving the cultural foundations laid down over nearly 9 centuries of independent rule. When Sultan Selim's forces defeated the last Mamluk Sultan and incorporated Egypt into the expanding Ottoman Empire, they initiated 3 centuries of provincial administration that would gradually give way to the most dramatic period of political, social, and economic transformation in Egyptian history. For the first 3 centuries of Ottoman rule, Egypt functioned as a wealthy but distant province, governed through a complex system that balanced imperial control with local autonomy, while maintaining many of the administrative and cultural institutions that had developed under previous Islamic dynasties. The Ottomans wisely retained much of the existing Mamluk administrative structure, allowing traditional elites to continue managing local affairs, while ensuring that Egypt's agricultural wealth flowed steadily toward Istanbul to fund the empire's military campaigns and administrative expenses. This period of relative stability began to fracture during the 18th century as Ottoman central authority weakened and provincial strongmen increasingly asserted their independence, creating the political vacuum that would eventually be filled by one of the most remarkable figures in Egyptian history. The arrival of Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition in 1798 marked the first major European intervention in Egypt since the Crusades, though the French occupation lasted only 3 years before British and Ottoman forces expelled the invaders. Its intellectual and administrative innovations would have lasting impact on Egyptian society. The most significant consequence of this period of upheaval was the rise of Muhammad Ali Pasha, an Albanian military commander who seized power in 1805 and ruled Egypt for nearly half a century, while implementing modernization programs that earned him recognition as the founder of modern Egypt. Muhammad Ali's vision extended far beyond simple administrative reform. He sought to create a modern state that could compete with European powers while maintaining Egypt's Islamic character and Arab identity. Muhammad Ali's modernization programs were both impressive in scope and ruthless in implementation, transforming Egypt's military, economy, education, and infrastructure through policies that combined European techniques with centralized control that concentrated unprecedented power in the hands of the state. His new army, trained by French officers and equipped with modern weapons, became the most effective military force in the Middle East, while his agricultural reforms increased cotton production and provided the revenue necessary to fund ambitious industrial and educational projects. The Pasha's educational missions to Europe introduced a generation of young Egyptians to Western ideas and techniques, creating an educated class that would later lead Egypt's nationalist movement, while contributing to the Arabic literary renaissance known as Al-Nahda. The establishment of the Bulaq printing press in 1820 enabled the translation and publication of European works alongside traditional Islamic texts, fostering intellectual exchange that would have profound implications for Egyptian and broader Arab culture. However, Muhammad Ali's modernization came at an enormous human cost, as his policies required harsh taxation, forced labor, and military conscription that devastated rural communities while enriching the state and its allies. His industrial experiment ultimately failed due to European competition and the lack of essential resources, while his military campaigns, though initially successful, eventually prompted European intervention that limited Egypt's territorial expansion and forced the dynasty to accept continued Ottoman suzerainty. The reign of Ismail Pasha from 1863 to 1879 represented both the culmination and crisis of the Muhammad Ali dynasty's modernization efforts, as Ismail's grandiose projects and extravagant lifestyle created a debt crisis that would ultimately surrender Egyptian independence to European creditors. Ismail's vision of transforming Egypt into a part of Europe led to ambitious infrastructure projects, including the completion of the Suez Canal in 1869, but also to reckless borrowing that increased Egypt's foreign debt from £3 million in 1863 to over £90 million by 1876. The debt crisis created the conditions for European intervention that would dominate Egyptian affairs for the next 3/4 of a century, as British and French creditors established joint financial control over Egyptian revenues while gradually assuming control of key government functions. When nationalist army officers led by Ahmed Urabi revolted against this foreign domination in 1882, Britain responded with military invasion that established what became known as the Veiled Protectorate, a system of indirect rule that maintained the fiction of Ottoman sovereignty while placing real power in British hands. British rule in Egypt proved remarkably durable and economically beneficial for Britain while creating the political tensions that would eventually fuel the nationalist movement that ended the occupation. Lord Cromer's administration, from 1883 to 1907, established efficient fiscal management and infrastructure development that restored Egypt's financial stability, but at the cost of political autonomy and economic independence that increasingly frustrated educated Egyptians who had absorbed European ideas about national self-determination. The experience of World War I intensified Egyptian resentment against British rule while demonstrating Egypt's strategic importance to the British Empire, as the country served as a major base for military operations in the Middle East, while Egyptian resources and labour supported the war effort. The declaration of a formal British protectorate in 1914 eliminated even the pretense of Ottoman sovereignty, creating the political context for the revolutionary uprising that would ultimately lead to Egyptian independence. The Egyptian Revolution of 1919 marked the beginning of Egypt's successful struggle for independence and the emergence of Saad Zaghloul as the charismatic leader of the nationalist movement that would dominate Egyptian politics for the next 3 decades. Zaghloul's Wafd Party skillfully combined popular mobilization with diplomatic pressure, using strikes, demonstrations, and international appeals to force Britain to recognize Egyptian independence while retaining significant influence over Egyptian foreign policy and defense. The achievement of nominal independence in 1922 created the Kingdom of Egypt under Fuad Wurst, establishing a constitutional monarchy that balanced royal authority with parliamentary government while navigating the competing pressures of British influence, popular nationalism, and traditional elite interests. The new constitution of 1923 created a parliamentary system that gave the Wafd Party massive electoral victories and established democratic traditions that would influence Egyptian politics long after the monarchy's abolition. However, the monarchical period from 1922 to 1952 was characterized by persistent political instability as King Farouk, the Wafd Party, and British authorities struggled for control, while Egypt faced mounting social and economic challenges that the existing system proved incapable of addressing effectively. The humiliating defeat in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War discredited both the monarchy and the traditional political parties, while highlighting the corruption and incompetence that had alienated much of the Egyptian public. The Free Officers' Revolution of July 23, 1952, has represented a fundamental break with Egypt's past, as a group of young military officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew King Farouk and established a republic committed to social justice, Arab nationalism, and independence from foreign control. The revolution initially proceeded under the leadership of General Mohammed Naguib, but Nasser gradually consolidated power and emerged as the dominant figure in Egyptian politics, while implementing radical reforms that transformed Egyptian society. Nasser's domestic policies included comprehensive land reform that redistributed large estates to peasant farmers, nationalization of major industries and banks, and massive infrastructure projects, including the Aswan High Dam, that provided electricity and irrigation for economic development. His foreign policy emphasized Arab unity, support for anti-colonial movements throughout Africa and Asia, and non-alignment in the Cold War that positioned Egypt as a leader of the developing world, while maintaining independence from both Soviet and Western blocs. The Suez Crisis of 1956 proved to be Nasser's greatest triumph and established his reputation throughout the Arab world as the champion of anti-imperialism and Arab nationalism, When Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in response to Western withdrawal of funding for the Aswan High Dam, Britain, France, and Israel launched a coordinated attack that was defeated by international pressure led by the United States and Soviet Union, leaving the canal under Egyptian control and making Nasser a hero throughout the developing world. However, Nasser's policies also created significant economic and political problems, as state-led industrialization proved inefficient, while authoritarian political control suppressed opposition and limited democratic participation. The disastrous defeat in the Six-Day War of 1967 shattered Egypt's military confidence and led to Israeli occupation of the Sinai Peninsula, creating a national crisis that dominated the final years of Nasser's presidency until his death in 1970. The accession of Anwar Sadat to the presidency marked a dramatic shift in Egyptian domestic and foreign policy, as the new leader gradually dismantled many of Nasser's socialist policies while reorienting Egypt toward the West and pursuing peace with Israel. Sadat's economic liberalization policies, known as infitah, encouraged private investment and foreign trade while reducing state control over the economy, though these changes created new inequalities and social tensions alongside economic growth. Sadat's most significant achievement was the October War of 1973, which restored Egyptian military confidence and created the diplomatic momentum that would eventually lead to peace with Israel and the recovery of the Sinai Peninsula. The initial success of Egyptian forces in crossing the Suez Canal and breaking through Israeli defenses demonstrated that Arab armies could compete effectively with Israeli military superiority while providing Sadat with the credibility necessary to pursue diplomatic solutions to the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Camp David Accords of 1978 represented Sadat's boldest gamble, as he became the first Arab leader to recognize Israel in exchange for the return of Sinai and substantial American economic aid that continues to support Egypt to this day. While the peace treaty with Israel restored Egyptian territory and provided economic benefits, it also isolated Egypt from the Arab world and contributed to the domestic opposition that culminated in Sadat's assassination by Islamic extremists in October 1981. The presidency of Hosni Mubarak from 1981 to 2011 represented a period of relative stability and gradual economic liberalization that maintained Egypt's strategic partnerships with the United States and Israel while pursuing moderate policies that avoided dramatic changes in domestic or foreign affairs. Mubarak's three-decade rule provided political predictability that encouraged investment and economic development, but also created a system of authoritarian governance that concentrated power in presidential hands while limiting political participation and democratic development. The Egyptian Revolution of 2011, inspired by similar uprisings throughout the Arab world, demonstrated the power of popular mobilization in the modern era, as millions of Egyptians gathered in Tahrir Square and other locations to demand Mubarak's resignation and democratic reform. The success of these peaceful demonstrations in forcing Mubarak from power after 18 days of protest highlighted both the persistence of democratic aspirations among ordinary Egyptians and the fragility of authoritarian systems that lack popular legitimacy. However, the aftermath of the revolution also demonstrated the complexity of democratic transition in societies with limited experience of pluralistic politics, as competing groups struggled to define Egypt's future direction while managing economic challenges and security concerns that had accumulated during decades of authoritarian rule. The brief presidency of Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohammed Morsi from 2012 to 2013 ended with his removal by military forces led by Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who subsequently won election as president and has governed Egypt since 2014. Contemporary Egypt under President Sisi faces the familiar challenges of balancing economic development with political stability, while maintaining Egypt's regional leadership role and strategic partnerships that have defined Egyptian foreign policy since the 1970s. Major infrastructure projects, including the new administrative capital and expansion of the Suez Canal, demonstrate the government's commitment to economic modernization, while security challenges in the Sinai Peninsula and regional instability require continued attention to defense and counter-terrorism efforts. Throughout these transformations, Egypt has maintained its cultural significance as the center of Arabic literature, Islamic scholarship, and Middle Eastern intellectual life, with institutions like Al-Azhar University continuing to influence Islamic thought, while Egyptian cinema, television, and literature reach audiences throughout the Arab world. The preservation of Egypt's remarkable archaeological heritage, alongside the development of modern infrastructure, reflects the country's continuing effort to balance respect for its extraordinary historical legacy with the demands of contemporary development. Modern Egypt's journey from Ottoman province to contemporary republic illustrates both the possibilities and challenges of political and economic transformation in the developing world. As successive generations of leaders have sought to create prosperity and security while preserving the cultural identity that connects contemporary Egyptians to their remarkable historical heritage. The resilience of Egyptian society through periods of foreign occupation, revolutionary change, war, and economic transformation demonstrates the enduring strength of the cultural foundations established over millennia of continuous civilization. As Egypt looks toward the future, the country continues to grapple with the fundamental questions that have shaped its modern history. How to achieve economic prosperity while preserving social stability, how to maintain regional leadership while managing domestic challenges, and how to honor the legacy of one of humanity's greatest civilizations while building institutions capable of meeting the needs of a growing population in an increasingly complex world. The answers to these questions will determine whether Egypt can fulfill its potential as a bridge between past and future, East and West, tradition and modernity.